You already know the thrill of a chess sacrifice. That moment when you give up a piece, chasing after a dream of attack or a path to victory. It feels bold, even brilliant. But here's the thing. Most sacrifices fail not because players miss a tactic, but because they buy into patterns and logic that the position does not actually support. The real story is not about courage. It is about when the board truly gives you enough to justify the risk, and when it does not. This video is a systematic training guide to why most chess sacrifices fall short, and how to build the discipline to spot the difference. We are going deep into the false logic that tempts players to part with material, the wishful thinking behind unsound attacks, and the subtle pattern-matching errors that even experienced players make. Along the way, you will see the real conditions that turn a sacrifice from a hopeful gamble into a genuine advantage. We will break down specific sacrifice patterns to expose exactly what separates a sound idea from a costly mistake, and the answers are more precise than most players expect. By the end, you will see sacrifices with a sharper, more honest eye. Let us get started. Chapter 1. What a sacrifice actually is, and what it is not. Giving up a piece in chess can mean one of three things: a mistake, a calculated exchange that recovers the material right away, or a sacrifice. These scenarios look identical from the outside for about half a second, and that half a second is exactly where most confusion about sacrifices begins. So let's get the definition right, because everything else in understanding sacrifices depends on it. A sacrifice is a deliberate, voluntary decision to give up material without immediately recovering equivalent material in return. The player who makes it expects to get something back, but not a piece of equal value on the next move. What they expect instead is some form of advantage that does not show up on the material ledger: an attack, an initiative, a structural improvement, a king that becomes exposed, a set of pieces that become dramatically more active. That expected return is called compensation, and this formalizes what was introduced earlier. Compensation is the whole justification for the sacrifice. The word deliberate matters here more than any other word in that definition. Intent is what separates a sacrifice from a blunder. If you move a piece to a square where your opponent captures it, and you had no plan for that, no expected return, no calculated sequence, that is a blunder. It is not a sacrifice. The external result looks the same. Material left the board. But the internal reality is completely different. One was a decision. The other was an error. This is worth pausing on because there is a widespread habit, especially among players still developing their calculation skills, of calling a blunder a sacrifice after the fact. The move gets played, material is lost, and then the label sacrifice gets applied to make the loss feel intentional. That is not how the classification works. A sacrifice is defined by what the player was thinking before the move, not by what story gets told about it afterward. A trade is also not a sacrifice, and that difference is equally important. When you exchange your bishop for your opponent's bishop, or your rook for their rook, you are giving up material and recovering material of roughly the same value almost immediately. The ledger stays balanced. There is no lasting deficit. A sacrifice, by contrast, creates a deficit that persists, at least for a while, and sometimes permanently. The player who sacrifices is knowingly stepping into a position where they have less material than their opponent, and they are doing it on purpose because they believe the compensation justifies it. Now, within the category of sacrifices, there is a separation that changes how you should think about any given example. That difference is between a pseudo-sacrifice and a true sacrifice. A pseudo-sacrifice is one where the material is expected to come back by force. The player gives up a piece, but they have calculated a sequence of moves, typically involving checks, captures, or direct threats that the opponent cannot ignore, that leads to recovering the invested material, often with something extra on top. The material deficit is real during the sequence, but it is temporary by design. The player has seen the whole path and knows the material is coming back. The reason this category matters is that pseudo-sacrifices are essentially forced wins, wearing dramatic clothing. They look bold and exciting, but the player who plays them is not taking a leap of faith. They have done the calculation. They know what is going to happen. The skill involved is real, and the calculation required can be genuinely difficult, but the nature of the decision is different from what most people imagine when they picture a sacrifice. A significant number of celebrated combinations in chess history fall into this category. A piece gets given up. The opponent is put under a series of checks and threats, and several moves later the material comes back with interest, or the game ends in checkmate. These are beautiful, and they require precise vision, but they are not gambles. They are calculations that happen to involve a temporary material investment. A true sacrifice is different. In a true sacrifice, the player accepts a lasting material deficit and does not expect to recover the invested material through a forced sequence. What they expect instead is a set of ongoing advantages: a permanently weakened opposing king, a dominant piece placement, a structural edge, a long-term initiative. These advantages are real, but they cannot be precisely calculated to a definitive conclusion. The player is making a judgment call about whether the position they are creating is worth more than the material they are giving up. This is where genuine uncertainty enters the picture. In a pseudo-sacrifice, the player can verify the decision by calculating to the end of the forced sequence. In a true sacrifice, no such verification is fully available. The player has to assess the resulting position, weigh the compensation against the material deficit, and decide that the position is worth it. That assessment requires experience and judgment, not just calculation. Neither category is superior to the other. Both require skill. Both can be correct or incorrect, depending on the position. The difference is about the nature of the decision being made, not about which type is more admirable. The reason to understand this separation now is that it changes what you need to do when evaluating a candidate's sacrifice. If you are considering a pseudo-sacrifice, the question is whether you have calculated the forced sequence correctly. If you are considering a true sacrifice, the question is whether your judgment about the resulting position is sound. Those are different questions, and they require different tools. With that framework in place, it helps to think about material decisions more broadly, as sitting on a spectrum. At one end of that spectrum is the blunder. Material is lost, there is no compensation, and the move makes the position worse. At the other end is the sound sacrifice, where the compensation is real and sufficient, and where correct defensive play by the opponent still leaves the sacrificing side with enough advantage to justify the material investment. In between those two poles is a wide middle ground occupied by speculative decisions. A speculative sacrifice is one where the compensation is real but uncertain. The player senses attacking potential, sees that the opponent's king will become exposed, or feels that the initiative will be significant, but cannot fully verify that the resulting position is objectively sufficient. The decision is motivated by practical chances, by the difficulty the opponent will face in defending, and sometimes by the psychological pressure the position creates. These are legitimate considerations, but they are different from the certainty that comes with a fully calculated forced sequence or a well-established positional judgment. The important thing to understand about the spectrum is that the external appearance of a material giveaway tells you almost nothing about where on it a move actually falls. A piece left on a square where it can be captured might be a blunder, a speculative sacrifice, or a sound sacrifice. The board position is what determines which one it is. The same material investment that is a blunder in one position might be a sound sacrifice in a slightly different arrangement of pieces. This is where a common mistake comes from. Players see a piece being given up and assume the move is either brilliant or reckless, based on how it feels, rather than on what the position actually supports. The aggressive-looking piece giveaway that wins the game might have been objectively forced. The quiet-looking positional concession might have been the most creative decision of the game. The label does not come from the drama of the move. It comes from the analysis. One thing that has become clearer in recent years is that computer analysis has sharpened the boundary between these categories. Some sacrifices that were long celebrated as brilliant have turned out to be objectively insufficient under precise defensive play, at least according to current engine evaluation. Others that seemed speculative have been assessed as sound under best play. The tools available now make it possible to check where on the spectrum a given decision actually falls, and that has changed how instructors and players talk about historical examples. A sacrifice that succeeded because the opponent could not find the refutation is instructive, but it is not the same as a sacrifice that succeeds even against best play. That understanding is worth holding on to, because the goal in developing your own understanding of sacrifices is not just to recognize them when they appear. The aim is to be able to evaluate them before committing to them. That means asking the right questions. Is this material coming back by force, or am I accepting a lasting deficit? If it is coming back, have I calculated the full sequence? If I am accepting a deficit, what is the compensation, and is it genuinely sufficient? And if I cannot fully answer those questions, where does this decision fall on the spectrum between a sound sacrifice and a speculative gamble? Those questions are the mental filter that makes the difference between playing a sacrifice and guessing at one. The definition of a sacrifice is not just vocabulary. It is the frame through which every material decision on the board gets evaluated. Chapter 2: How Players Miscalculate Compensation. Knowing the difference between a sacrifice and a blunder gets you to the starting line. What happens next is where most players run into trouble. The decision to give up material is only half the work. The other half is accurately measuring what you get in return, and that measurement is where calculation breaks down far more often than people expect. The compensation you receive for sacrificed material falls into three broad categories. The first is dynamic compensation: initiative, attack, tempo, and piece activity. The second is structural compensation: improvements to pawn structure, weak squares you can occupy, open files your rooks can use, or the bishop pair operating on open diagonals. The third is material compensation: the expectation of winning back different material later through a forced or near-forced sequence. These three categories are not equally reliable, and that gap in reliability is the first thing worth understanding. Dynamic compensation is vivid. When you sacrifice a pawn and your pieces flood toward the enemy king, the position feels electric. That feeling is real, but it is tied to a clock. Structural compensation is quieter. A weak square does not announce itself the way a check does, but it also does not disappear after 2 moves of accurate defense. Material compensation sits somewhere in between, because it depends on whether the recovery sequence actually works. The reason these categories matter is not just classification. They function as a sorting tool. Before you sacrifice, You should be able to place your expected return into at least one of these buckets, and then test whether what is in that bucket is genuinely there. A vague sense that the position looks promising does not belong in any bucket. The framework forces you to be specific, and specificity is what separates a calculated sacrifice from wishful thinking. Most failed sacrifices involve overestimating dynamic compensation. Initiative is the most frequently cited reason for giving up material, and it is the most frequently misjudged. The reason is straightforward. Initiative feels concrete in the moment. You are making threats. Your opponent is responding. It looks like you are in control. But initiative has an expiration condition built into it, and that condition is easy to miss when you are calculating forward. Here is the core of it. Every move you spend generating a threat that does not force a decisive concession gives the defender one more step toward consolidation. That is not a metaphor. It is a literal accounting of the position. If you sacrifice a piece and generate 5 consecutive threats, but the defender answers each one without giving up anything critical, you have spent 5 moves and your opponent has spent 5 moves getting their pieces coordinated and their king safe. The material deficit is still there. The initiative is not. The distinction that matters is between sustaining initiative and converting it into something concrete. Sustaining initiative means you keep making threats your opponent must answer. Converting initiative means those threats produce a real gain, checkmate, a decisive material recovery, or permanent structural damage. The gap between those two states is exactly where most attacking sacrifices stall. Players sustain initiative for several moves, feel confident, and then discover that the defender has one strong defensive resource that neutralizes the remaining threats. At that point, the initiative has expired, and the material deficit has not. A useful habit is to count the forcing moves available to you, and compare them against the defensive resources available to your opponent. If you can see a sequence of checks and threats, ask whether each one forces a specific, damaging response, or whether the defender has a quiet move that simultaneously blocks 2 of your ideas. Quiet defensive moves are the ones that kill initiative fastest, because they do not look dangerous, but they close multiple doors at once. One more thing worth sitting with. Holding the initiative does not confirm the sacrifice was sound. It only confirms you have not run out of threats yet. The question is whether the initiative leads somewhere decisive before the defender consolidates. If it does not, you have been deferring the loss, not avoiding it. Structural compensation operates on a different timeline. A weak square in the opponent's position does not go away after one defensive move. An open file stays open. Doubled pawns stay doubled. These features are durable in a way that initiative is not, which makes structural compensation genuinely valuable when it is real. The problem is that it imposes a different burden on the sacrificing player, the burden of technique. Structural compensation is only valid when a concrete plan exists to exploit it. This is the part that trips up a lot of players. You sacrifice a pawn, the opponent ends up with doubled pawns on a half-open file, and you feel justified. But doubled pawns that are not under attack are not suffering. A weak square that no piece can reach is not a weakness. An open file that your rooks cannot access is just an empty column. They look like compensation on a diagram, but they do not translate into real pressure unless you can get your pieces to the right places. The specific test for a weak square is whether you can occupy it with a piece that cannot be easily challenged or traded off. A knight on a strong outpost square that the opponent cannot attack with pawns or exchange away is genuine compensation. A knight that reaches the outpost but gets immediately swapped off has not exploited anything. The same logic applies to open files. The question is not whether the file is open. The question is whether your rooks can reach it, penetrate along it, and attack something that matters. The bishop pair is a structural advantage in open positions where the diagonals are clear. In closed positions with locked pawn chains, the bishops are cramped and the advantage shrinks considerably. So even structural compensation has positional conditions attached to it. Naming the structural feature is not enough. You need to verify that the position type actually allows you to use it. Where amateur players most often go wrong with structural compensation is not in identifying it, but in stopping there. They see the doubled pawns, they feel the sacrifice was justified, and they move forward without a specific plan. Then the opponent plays a pawn break, the structure gets liquidated, and the compensation disappears. Structural advantages require active maintenance. They do not convert themselves. Putting this together into a practical discipline before you sacrifice is the point of all of it. It has to be applied explicitly rather than felt vaguely. Start by identifying which category of compensation you expect. Is it dynamic, structural, or material? Be specific. If you cannot place it in a category, that is a signal the compensation is not clearly defined yet. Once you have identified the category, verify that the compensation is concrete. For dynamic compensation, that means identifying the specific threats you will generate and checking whether they force damaging responses or whether the defender has a resource that neutralizes them. For structural compensation, that means naming the specific feature and confirming that a piece can reach and exploit it. For material compensation, that means checking whether the recovery sequence actually works against the opponent's best defense. Next, estimate how long the compensation will remain active. Dynamic compensation has a short window. If you cannot see a path to something decisive within a few moves, the initiative will likely expire before you get there. Structural compensation lasts longer, but requires technique to convert. Ask whether you have a realistic plan to increase pressure on the structural feature over the next several moves. Finally, confirm that a conversion plan exists before the material leaves the board. This is the step that most players skip. They identify the compensation and assume conversion will work itself out. It usually does not. Knowing that you will have initiative is not the same as knowing how you will use it to win. Exploiting weak squares requires a plan for how your pieces will reach and utilize them. This checklist is not a formula that produces a guaranteed answer. There are positions where you do everything right, and the sacrifice still does not work, because chess is complicated, and opponents find moves you did not see. What the checklist does is close off the most common failure modes. It forces every vague assumption into an explicit claim that can be tested. If you cannot articulate at least one or two independent forms of concrete compensation before committing, that is a strong signal to pause. The deeper value of practicing this framework is that it gets faster. In analysis, working through each step takes time. In a tournament game under time pressure, you cannot afford that. Players who rehearse this kind of structured evaluation during practice games tend to find that it becomes more automatic over time. The categories become instinctive. The questions get asked quickly. The gaps in compensation become visible faster. What you are building is not a checklist you consult. It is a habit of thought that runs in the background every time a sacrifice appears on the board. Reach a point where you cannot commit to giving up material without having already verified, at least roughly, what you are getting in return, and whether you can actually use it. That is the difference between a player who calculates compensation and one who merely assumes it. Chapter 3: The Psychology of the Speculative Sacrifice. Understanding the compensation framework and knowing the specific ways evaluation breaks down gets you a long way. Yet beneath all of that lies another layer, operating at the level of how your mind works under the pressure of a real game. Even players who can articulate exactly what a sacrifice requires will sometimes play one that violates every condition they have just named. The reason is not ignorance. It is that certain mental patterns can override analytical knowledge at the moment of decision, and they do it quietly enough that the move still feels correct when you play it. These patterns are not random. They are predictable, and they show up consistently across skill levels. Understanding them is not about catching yourself being irrational. It is about recognizing the specific shape of each one so you can notice when it is operating. The first pattern involves the very thing that makes experienced players strong. That speed is a genuine skill. It is also the source of a specific kind of error. When you have studied a well-known attacking sacrifice, your mind builds a template for it. The template includes the surface features, the piece placement, the pawn structure, the general shape of the position. When a new position shares enough of those features, the template activates. The pattern feels present. And in a real game, under time pressure, that feeling of recognition carries a lot of weight. The problem is that a pattern can activate on partial information. A position might share 3 out of 4 required conditions for a sacrifice to work. The surface looks right. The pieces are roughly in the right places. But one critical element is missing. Maybe the opponent has a defensive resource that did not exist in the original template, or the necessary lines are not actually open, or your own pieces are not coordinated enough to follow through. The pattern fires anyway, because the match was close enough. This failure mode has been noted in instructional chess literature. Players who imitate famous sacrifices without verifying whether the specific positional prerequisites are present in their own position risk making unjustified material concessions. The imitation is not the error. The missing verification step is. Complicating this is the fact that the more patterns you have internalized, the more confident you become when one activates. That confidence is usually earned. But it can suppress the instinct to check whether all the conditions are actually met. Recognizing a pattern and confirming that it applies are 2 separate steps, and the feeling of recognition can make the second step feel unnecessary. Consider this perspective. Pattern recognition tells you what to look for. It does not tell you what is there. Those are different questions, and in a real game they require different mental effort. The moment of recognition is the beginning of evaluation, not the end of it. A related point: this error tends to be more costly when calculation depth is shallow. If you recognize a pattern and immediately play the move, you have skipped the verification that would catch the missing condition. The sacrifice goes on the board before the gap is found. Slowing down after a pattern activates, not to doubt the pattern but to run through the actual requirements in the actual position, is where the error gets caught. The second pattern operates after the sacrifice has already been played. Once material is on the table, the psychological landscape of the position changes. You are now down material. The attack needs to work. And here is where a specific bias takes hold. Players in an attacking mindset systematically overestimate the strength of their own threats and underestimate the defensive resources available to the opponent. This optimism is not random. It intensifies in proportion to how much material has been given up. The more you have invested, the more the position needs to justify that investment. And the mind, trying to protect you from the discomfort of having made a mistake, tends to find reasons why the attack is stronger than it actually is. A common instructional observation captures this well. Many players assume that the immediate material loss from a sacrifice will automatically generate a superior future advantage. The word automatically is the problem. Compensation does not generate itself. It has to be concretely present in the position and concretely usable. But optimism bias replaces that verification with an assumption. This is where sunk cost thinking enters. In chess, sunk cost thinking looks like this. You press the attack, not because the position supports it, but because stopping feels like admitting the sacrifice was wrong. The material is already gone. Changing course means accepting that the position is now worse. That psychological cost is real, and it pushes players to continue, rather than reassess. The analytically correct response to a sacrifice that has not worked is often an immediate shift toward damage control, finding the best defensive or consolidating move available, even if it means playing without the material for a long time, or accepting a worse position and trying to hold it. But that shift requires acknowledging the situation clearly, and optimism bias delays exactly that acknowledgement. Layered on top of the original error is a second error, continuing the attack past the point where the position supports it. The first mistake was the sacrifice. The second mistake is refusing to reassess. And the second one is often what turns a recoverable deficit into a lost game. An instructional observation captures this well. Some players continue attacking after an unsuccessful sacrifice instead of reassessing the position, and this tendency compounds the material disadvantage. The attack was the plan. When the plan stops working, the plan needs to change. But optimism bias makes it genuinely difficult to see that the plan has stopped working, because the mind is still looking for the version of the position where the attack succeeds. Sustained aggression is not a virtue independent of what the position actually supports. That framing matters. Pressing forward can look like commitment or fighting spirit. But if the position does not support it, it is just a delay in accepting a worse outcome. In contrast to the previous patterns, the third pattern has a more social origin, though it operates just as structurally. Chess is played in front of others, or in the presence of an internal audience that the player carries into every game. That audience, whether literal spectators, tournament opponents, or the player's own sense of identity at the board, creates pressure to produce exciting, memorable chess. And the sacrifice is the most visually dramatic decision available. This pressure is not confined to beginners or to public events. It appears at high levels of competitive play. The structural reason is that a player's sense of how they want to be seen, as bold, as creative, as an attacker, can become part of how they evaluate candidate moves. A sacrifice that fits that identity gets evaluated slightly differently than one that does not. The chess.com blog, El Dilemma del Sacrificio, Genio o Loco, documents this directly. Some players sacrifice pieces largely to surprise the opponent or entertain spectators, and instructional authors contrast this explicitly with sacrifices based on objective positional demands. The contrast is not between boldness and caution. It is between two different sources of the decision. A sacrifice driven by a concrete positional or tactical justification goes through a different mental process than one driven by the desire to create a spectacle. The first starts with the position and asks what it demands. The second starts with the desired outcome and looks for a position that might support it. Those are opposite directions, and they produce different quality decisions. Additionally, there is a competitive pressure version of this effect. Some players look for sacrifices mainly when they are behind on the scoreboard or in the position, accepting greater material risk than the objective situation warrants, because the desire to change the game outweighs the evaluation of whether the sacrifice actually works. The sacrifice becomes a response to the emotional state of the game, rather than to the board. None of this means ambition is a flaw, or that attacking chess is a mistake. The point is narrower than that. The question is whether the decision to sacrifice is being driven by what the position contains, or by something external to it. When the external pressure is strong enough, it can substitute for positional justification, without the player noticing. What connects all three of these patterns is that none of them feel like errors when they are happening. Pattern recognition feels like expertise. Optimism about the attack feels like confidence. The desire to play boldly feels like competitive spirit. Each one has a legitimate version and a distorted version, and the distorted version is hard to catch in the moment because it is wearing the clothes of something real. But they are predictable. They follow a consistent structure. They appear under consistent conditions. And that predictability is what makes them manageable. You cannot eliminate a bias you have not named. Once you know the shape of each one, you can start to notice when the position is triggering it. Chapter 4: The Greek Gift Sacrifice and the Conditions that Make it Work. There is a specific bishop sacrifice that appears more often in chess instruction than almost any other tactical motif. It goes by the name the Greek gift. White's bishop captures on h7. The king is forced out into the open, and a coordinated queen and knight attack follows. The pattern is well known enough that many players recognize it on sight. That familiarity is exactly what makes it dangerous to misapply. Knowing the name of a pattern is not the same as understanding when it works. The Greek gift has clear structural requirements, and when those requirements are all present, the sacrifice is not speculative at all. It is close to forced. But when even one of them is missing, the attacker is typically left a piece down, with no attack and no way back. The goal of this chapter is to make the difference between those two situations concrete and checkable. Start with what the sacrifice actually does. When the bishop takes on h7, the immediate effect is not an attack. It is a displacement. The king is pulled off its safe square and pushed into territory where it has no shelter and no coordination with its own pieces. That displacement is the mechanism. The attack comes after. Once the king steps onto h7, the knight jumps to g5. This is the move that begins to tighten the net. The knight on g5 does two things at once. It threatens to support the queen's entry to h5, and it cuts off the king's most natural retreat path. The queen then swings to h5, and from there the pressure becomes direct. The king is caught between the queen bearing down from h5, the knight sitting on g5, and the fact that its own pieces are too far away or too poorly placed to intervene in time. The bishop's material value becomes irrelevant the moment the king is exposed. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it runs against the instinct to count pieces. A bishop is normally worth 3 pawns. But a bishop traded for a cornered king, a forced march into open space, and a queen-knight battery aimed at the resulting position is not a trade in the ordinary sense. The compensation is not another piece. It is the geometry of the resulting position, which the opponent cannot rearrange. What makes this different from a speculative sacrifice is the forcing quality of the sequence. After the bishop lands on h7 and the king accepts, the continuation is not a matter of hoping the attack develops. The follow-up moves are narrow and compulsory. The knight goes to g5. The queen enters on h5. The king has limited squares. Each step follows from the last. That is what distinguishes a valid Greek gift from a position where the pattern merely looks similar. The forcing geometry is either present or it is not. Now for the conditions that make that geometry real. The first thing to confirm is the king's location. The defending king needs to be castled on the king side, sitting on g8, with the h-pawn still on h7. If the king has already moved, or if the h-pawn is gone, the structural basis for the sacrifice is not there. The second condition is the bishop's diagonal. The attacking bishop needs to already be aimed at h7 before the sacrifice is played. In many positions, this means the bishop is sitting on d3, with a clear diagonal running toward h7. In some setups, it can come from c2 instead, particularly when the queen is already placed on d1 or has vacated that diagonal. The exact starting square matters less than the diagonal being open and unobstructed. If a piece is sitting between the bishop and h7, the sacrifice cannot happen. The third condition is the knight's proximity to g5. After the bishop lands on h7 and the king steps out, the knight must be able to reach g5 immediately. If the knight is on f3, that jump is available. If the knight is on d2 or somewhere else entirely, it cannot get to g5 in one move, and the king gets a tempo to regroup. That single tempo can be enough to unravel the entire sequence. The fourth condition is the queen's access to h5. The queen needs a clear path to h5 after the knight moves to g5. If a piece is blocking that path, or if the queen is too far away to enter the attack quickly, the coordination breaks down. The queen on h5 is not optional. It is the piece that converts the king's exposure into a direct mating threat. Without it, the knight on g5 is just a piece sitting near the king, not a weapon. The fifth condition is the absence of a defender on f6 or h6. A knight sitting on f6 is the most common obstacle. It can block the queen's approach, cover key squares in the mating net, and in some lines even interpose to break up the attack entirely. A defending piece on h6 creates a different problem. It can give the king an escape square that the attack was designed to remove. If either of these pieces is in place, the sacrifice needs to be reconsidered, not adjusted. The condition is simply not met. These 5 conditions form a sequence, and the habit being built here is to run through them in order before committing to the sacrifice, not after. The verification step belongs before the bishop moves. Each condition is a checkpoint. If the checkpoint is clear, move to the next one. If any checkpoint is blocked, the sacrifice does not go. One additional structural detail matters and is worth naming separately. The attacking side's dark squared bishop plays a supporting role in many of these positions. After the king is exposed and the queen-knight battery is in motion, the dark squared bishop can cover key squares that prevent the defender from consolidating. If that bishop has already been traded off earlier in the game, the follow-up attack loses some of its coordination. This is not always decisive, but it is a factor worth checking when the position is close. Now consider what happens when the checklist is skipped. The most common failure mode is not a brilliant defensive resource from the opponent. It is the attacker playing the sacrifice, because the position looked like a Greek gift, without confirming that it actually was one. The h7 pawn is undefended. The bishop is on the right diagonal. The pattern fires. The bishop goes to h7. And then the knight cannot reach g5 in time, or the queen has no path to h5, or the defending knight on f6 is sitting exactly where it needs to be to disrupt the sequence. The result is not a slightly worse position. The attacker is a full bishop, down with no attack, and no structural compensation, which is typically a decisive deficit. At most levels of play, being a piece down with nothing to show for it is close to a decisive deficit. A subtler failure occurs when the king declines the sacrifice. If the defending king can simply stay on g8, and the attacker cannot generate sufficient threats to justify the lost material, the sacrifice has failed before the attack even begins. This is why checking whether the king is actually forced to accept is part of the verification process. A sacrifice that the opponent can decline is not a forced sequence. It is a donation. Another failure pattern involves the king having an escape square the attacker did not account for. If the defending side has previously pushed the h-pawn to h6, the king can sometimes retreat to h6 after accepting the bishop on h7, rather than being forced to g6 or g8. That one square can collapse the mating net entirely, because the queen-knight coordination was designed around a specific king position. When the king lands somewhere else, the geometry changes and the attack often evaporates. Each of these failures traces back to the same source. Not defensive brilliance. Not bad luck. A skipped condition. The attacker recognized the surface shape of the pattern and moved before completing the check. The previous chapter named this as pattern activation on partial information, and the Greek gift is a prime example of where that error has a concrete, measurable cost. The Greek gift makes its prerequisites unusually clear and enumerable, which is why it works as a training case. The habit of running through conditions before committing, treating each one as a checkpoint rather than a suggestion, is the same habit that applies to every forced sequence on the board. What changes from pattern to pattern is the list of checkpoints. What stays the same is the requirement to clear all of them before the piece moves. Chapter 5: Defensive Resources and Why Attackers Miss Them. The defensive side of the board is where most attacking ideas actually fall apart. Before you play any sacrifice, you need to spend genuine time on the other side of the board. Not a token effort. Not a single line that confirms what you already want to believe. A real attempt to find the move that makes your idea fail. That search is not a secondary check. It is the final and most demanding step in the whole process. The defender has more options than most attackers give credit for. It helps to think of those options in categories, because each one works differently, and each one gets missed for different reasons. The first category is returning material. When a defender gives back some or all of the sacrifice material, they are trading a temporary material advantage for a safer king and a simpler position. This works best when the attacker's pieces are active and coordinated, but not quite enough to force a decision. Returning material strips the attacker of that coordination. The position simplifies, the king gets safer, and suddenly the attacker is just down material with nothing to show for it. Attackers miss this resource because they assume the defender will cling to the extra piece or pawn. That assumption is often wrong. The second category is the desperado. A piece that is about to be lost anyway does not have to go quietly. It can capture something, give check, or land on a disruptive square before it disappears. A desperado move changes the material count, changes the pawn structure, or forces the king into an awkward position, all before the attacker's sequence can continue. The attacker expects a clean forcing line. The desperado makes that line messy. The third category is the interposition or blockade. Placing a piece or pawn on a critical square can close a line, block a check, or deny the attacker the geometry their combination depends on. Forcing sequences often rely on specific squares being open or specific diagonals being clear. A single well-placed piece can collapse the whole structure. The fourth category is counterattack. Instead of defending directly, The defender creates a threat of their own, often on the opposite side of the board, or against the attacker's king. Central counterplay with a pawn break is a common version of this. The attacker has to stop and deal with the new threat, and by the time they do, the momentum of the original attack has dissolved. This is especially effective when the attacker has committed pieces to one side and left the other side thin. The fifth category is the quiet defensive move. This one gets its own section shortly, because it is the most commonly missed. For now, note that it belongs in the toolkit alongside the others, and that it works by improving the defender's situation without announcing itself through a capture or a check. A common reason attackers miss these resources is not that they cannot calculate. It is that they tend to search in the wrong direction. They look for their own threats. They follow their own forcing lines forward. The opponent's answers only appear in that search as obstacles to be cleared, not as genuine alternatives to be evaluated on their own terms. Asking "what does my opponent do here?" has to be a deliberate act, not a side effect of calculating your own ideas. Of the 5 defensive categories, 2 are missed so consistently that they deserve closer attention. The first is the intermezzo, also called the Zwischenzug, which is German for in-between move. The second is the quiet defensive move. An intermezzo is a move inserted before the expected response. Instead of recapturing, instead of addressing the stated threat directly, the defender plays something else first, usually a check or a new threat, that changes the position before the original sequence resumes. The attacker anticipated a specific reply. The intermezzo delivers a different one, and the position the attacker calculated no longer exists. What makes intermezzos so hard to see from the attacking side is that calculation tends to be structured around forcing sequences. When you are building a line, you naturally focus on checks, captures, and direct threats. You expect your opponent to respond to those in kind. An intermezzo breaks that expectation. It is a forcing move in the other direction, and it arrives at a moment when the attacker is not looking for it. The quiet defensive move is harder still. It is not a check. It is not a capture. It does not announce itself. It simply improves the defender's position, covers a key square, removes a weakness, or improves piece coordination. Nothing about it triggers the pattern matching that catches tactical moves. It sits just outside the forcing move tree that most attackers use to evaluate their ideas. The practical consequence is significant. If you only test your sacrifice against forcing defensive replies, you are testing against an incomplete set of answers. The refutation might be a move that does nothing dramatic. It might just quietly make your combination not work. A king retreat to a slightly different square. A rook sliding to a defensive file. A pawn move that closes a critical diagonal. None of these look like refutations. All of them can be. The habit to build here is deliberate. When you evaluate a sacrifice, after you have followed the forcing lines, stop and ask whether there is a non-forcing defensive move that changes the picture. Specifically look for moves that improve the defender's coordination or cover a key square without giving you a tempo. If you cannot find one, you have done more than most attackers do. If you do find one, you have just saved yourself from a mistake. Refutation searching is a skill. It is not something some players are born with, and others are not. It is a practice, and it gets better with repetition. The core of the practice is this: before you play a sacrifice, spend genuine time trying to prove it wrong. Some coaches describe this as trying to kill your own combination. That framing is useful because it captures the right adversarial posture. You are not looking for reassurance. You are looking for the refutation. The asymmetry here is worth sitting with. If you find the refutation before you play, you have lost nothing. You set the idea aside, look for something better, and move on. If you find the refutation after you play, you have lost the game. The cost of the search is low. The cost of skipping it can be everything. The practical method is to switch sides mentally. After you have generated your attacking idea, pause and ask what you would play if you were defending this position. Not what the first obvious defensive move is. What the strongest defensive move is. What the move is that you would least want to see. Start there. Follow it. See if your combination still works. This is where the quiet defensive move and the intermezzo become especially important. When you switch sides, include non-forcing moves in your search. Ask whether there is a defensive resource that does not involve a check or a capture. Ask whether there is an in-between move that changes the sequence before your attack gets going. These are the moves that survive the attacker's calculation tree, precisely because the attacker never looked for them. A common pattern in amateur play is calculating one main line, finding that it looks good, and stopping there. The sacrifice gets played. The opponent finds a different reply. The line that looked good never appears on the board. The difference between that player and one who plays sound sacrifices consistently is not talent. It is the habit of asking one more question before the piece moves. The player who occasionally finds a brilliant sacrifice is often pattern recognizing, benefiting from a position that happened to match the template closely enough. The player who plays sound sacrifices more consistently has typically built the habit of switching sides, searching for the refutation, and only committing when the idea survives that search. One approach tends to produce memorable games. The other tends to produce winning ones. Chapter 6: The Exchange Sacrifice, and When Material Imbalance Creates Real Compensation. The sacrifices covered so far have mostly operated on a forcing logic. You give up material, you generate threats the opponent cannot easily sidestep, and the sequence either works or it does not. The exchange sacrifice is different. It does not resolve in a forcing line. The compensation it creates unfolds over many moves, sometimes dozens, and it requires a different way of thinking to evaluate honestly. So the first thing to get clear is what you are actually giving up. A rook is worth approximately 5 points on the standard material scale. A bishop or knight is worth approximately 3. When you sacrifice the exchange, you hand over the rook and keep the minor piece, and you begin the resulting position down roughly 2 points of material. That deficit is real. It shows up in the endgame if you reach one without converting your advantages. It shows up whenever the opponent's rook finds an open file and starts creating threats you have to answer. The material ledger does not forget. What this means practically is that the compensation for an exchange sacrifice cannot be vague. Saying you have good piece activity or that your position feels active is not enough. Activity is a temporary condition. It depends on the opponent's choices. It can evaporate after a few accurate defensive moves. The compensation needs to be concrete and durable, something that persists regardless of what the opponent does next. There are 3 forms of compensation that actually meet that standard. The first is a dominant minor piece, sitting on an outpost the opponent cannot challenge. The second is a structural advantage, typically a passed pawn or a pawn majority, that will eventually create one. The third is an attack so direct and fast-moving that the rook simply cannot get into the game in time to matter. That third case is the most time-sensitive and the hardest to evaluate reliably, because it depends on the position resolving before the material deficit becomes relevant. The first two are more durable, and they are where most sound exchange sacrifices find their justification. One more thing worth naming here. Annotators who work through Grandmaster games in this category tend to be explicit about what separates a sound exchange sacrifice from a speculative one. The sound ones can point to multiple concrete advantages. The speculative ones rest on a single factor, usually piece activity or vague pressure, and depend on the opponent making inaccuracies to stay alive. That distinction matters because it tells you what to look for when you are evaluating your own positions. The most reliable compensation for an exchange sacrifice is a permanently dominant minor piece, specifically a knight, placed on an outpost that the opponent's pawns cannot reach. The distinction that matters here is between an outpost that is temporarily unchallenged and one that is genuinely permanent. The enemy pawns that could theoretically advance to attack that square must either have already passed it or been traded off entirely. If there is any realistic pawn lever the opponent can use to dislodge the piece, the outpost is not permanent. This matters because the value of the knight on that square depends entirely on how long it stays there. A knight that dominates for 5 moves and then gets chased away did not justify the exchange sacrifice. The piece needs to sit on that square for long enough to exert decisive influence on the game, whether that means participating in an attack, controlling key entry points, or restricting the opponent's pieces. Permanence is not a bonus feature of a good outpost. It is the minimum requirement. The reason a knight on a genuine outpost can be worth more than the rook it replaced comes down to what each piece needs to function. A rook needs open files. Without them, it sits on the back rank, doing relatively little while the position is decided elsewhere. A knight on a strong central square needs only that square. It attacks multiple points simultaneously. It cannot be driven off, and it does not require open lines to be effective. In a closed or semi-closed position where the files stay blocked, the contrast between what the rook can do and what the outpost knight can do becomes stark. The rook is expensive and idle. The knight is cheaper and active everywhere it matters. Before committing to an exchange sacrifice for an outpost, the evaluation process has a specific step. Check which enemy pawns could theoretically advance to attack that square. Then ask whether advancing any of them would create serious weaknesses elsewhere in the opponent's position. If the answer is yes, the outpost is practically permanent, even if it is not technically immune. If the answer is no, the opponent can simply reorganize, and the outpost disappears. A common mistake at the club level is placing a knight on an impressive-looking square without running through that check. The square looks strong, the piece looks dominant, and the sacrifice gets played. Then 3 moves later, a pawn advanced the opponent had been preparing quietly, removes the knight from the position, and the material deficit has no compensation left. The outpost case is the clearest and most common justification for an exchange sacrifice, but it is not the only one. Structural advantages that exist independently of any single piece can also provide sufficient compensation, and understanding them extends the range of positions where an exchange sacrifice becomes a serious option. The 2 most important structural compensations are a passed pawn and a pawn majority. A passed pawn is the more immediate of the 2. If the side giving up the exchange has a passed pawn, especially one that is protected and already advanced, the rook on the other side faces a specific problem. It has to deal with that pawn. A rook is theoretically capable of blockading a passed pawn by placing itself directly in front of it, but that capability depends on the rook being in the right place and having no other urgent responsibilities. If the rook is passive, or if the passed pawn is supported by a minor piece that attacks the rook's blocking square, the blockade fails. A passed pawn on the 6th rank with piece support behind it is widely cited in instructional literature as a strong indicator that exchange sacrifice compensation may be sufficient on its own. A pawn majority is slower. It does not create an immediate threat. What it creates is potential, the ability to generate a passed pawn through normal pawn advances on one flank, typically the queen side. The compensation here is not what the position looks like right now, but what it will look like after the majority advances and creates a passer the opponent has to deal with. This kind of structural compensation requires thinking in terms of plans rather than forcing sequences. You are not calculating a line that ends in checkmate or material recovery. You are identifying a structural feature that will become decisive over time, and you are trusting that the rook cannot neutralize it before it does. The important correction here is that a rook does not automatically handle a passed pawn or a pawn majority. That assumption leads to underestimating structural compensation. A rook is powerful when it is active, coordinated with other pieces, and operating on open files. When it is tied down to passive defense of a pawn advance, or when it has to cover multiple threats simultaneously, its effectiveness drops considerably. Instead of asking whether a rook can theoretically stop the pawn, consider whether this rook, in this position, with these other pieces on the board, can stop it without conceding something else. One practical guideline that comes out of this: multiple independent structural assets are more reliable compensation than a single one. A passed pawn plus a strong outpost is a more convincing case than either one alone. When you can point to two separate structural features that each require the opponent's attention, the rook's task becomes genuinely difficult. When you can only point to one, the opponent may have just enough resources to neutralize it. Ultimately, understanding the nuances of exchange sacrifices involves assessing concrete advantages and potential threats. This evaluative process, rather than relying on a simple checklist, requires a nuanced appreciation of the position's dynamics and the ability to foresee how these elements will evolve over time. Chapter 7: Piece Activity Sacrifices and the Concept of Dynamic Compensation. By now you have a solid framework for evaluating exchange sacrifices. You know how to look for permanent outposts, supported passed pawns, and pawn majorities. Those are structural advantages. They persist on the board whether or not you keep generating threats. The opponent cannot simply make a quiet move and watch them disappear. Dynamic compensation works differently. And that difference is the entire subject of this chapter. When you sacrifice material for piece activity, open lines, or a development lead, what you gain is not permanent. It exists only while the position stays active and forcing. The moment your opponent finds a way to stabilize, the activity fades. The material deficit remains. That asymmetry is the core problem with dynamic compensation, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before moving on. A permanent outpost does not need you to do anything to maintain it. A passed pawn supported by pieces does not evaporate if you make a quiet developing move. But a dynamic advantage built on piece activity requires you to keep generating pressure. Every move that fails to threaten something concrete gives your opponent one more step toward consolidation. And once they consolidate, you are simply down material with no remaining justification for the sacrifice. This is the failure pattern that shows up most often at the intermediate level. The attack starts with energy. The pieces look active and coordinated. Then the opponent finds one stabilizing move. The pieces lose their momentum, and what looked like a promising sacrifice
turns out to have been a donation.
The position did not change dramatically. The activity just ran out of fuel. The reason this happens is that dynamic compensation carries a clock. Static advantages do not.
A sacrifice justified by activity must either force a decisive result before consolidation arrives, or successfully convert the activity into something structural and lasting.
If neither happens within the relevant window of moves, the compensation expires. The material disadvantage lingers. That window is not infinite, and it is often shorter than it feels.
Piece activity can look impressive for several moves, while gradually losing viability.
The practical consequence is that before any activity-based sacrifice is played, you need to know what you are converting it into, and roughly how many moves you have to do it. Now, what actually generates dynamic compensation in the first place? The three most commonly cited sources are open files, open diagonals, and a development lead. Each one can be genuine compensation. Each one can also be nominal, meaning it looks like an asset, but does not actually function as one given the specific position on the board. An open file is only meaningful compensation when you control it exclusively, or at least when your opponent cannot contest it within the relevant time window. A file that both sides can occupy equally is not compensation. It is a shared resource. The question is not whether the file is open.
The question is whether your pieces can use it to invade the opponent's position before they can organize a defense or occupy it themselves.
The same logic applies to open diagonals.
A bishop aimed at a long diagonal sounds powerful.
But if the diagonal is blocked by pawns, or if the opponent's king is not on that diagonal and has no reason to be, the diagonal is not doing real work. The compensation is nominal. What makes a diagonal genuine is that it creates direct, sustained pressure on something the opponent must defend, specifically the king, or a major piece that cannot easily move. Development leads are the trickiest of the three to evaluate honestly.
A development lead is meaningful when your opponent has pieces that have not entered the game and cannot do so quickly enough to help defend.
But if your opponent has already completed development, or nearly so, the lead is largely gone. You are not ahead in development anymore. You are simply down material.
This is one of the most common overestimations at the intermediate level.
A player looks at their own pieces and sees activity. They look at their opponent's pieces and see that they are slightly less coordinated. They call that a development lead and use it to justify a sacrifice. But if the opponent can complete coordination in 2 or 3 moves, that lead is not going to survive long enough to convert. The honest question to ask is whether the opponent's extra material is structurally unable to enter the game before your activity converts. Not whether it looks awkward right now. Whether it will still be awkward when your activity reaches its peak. If the answer is no, the development lead is not the compensation you think it is. A related mistake is treating any open line as automatically valuable.
Players sacrifice a pawn or a piece, point to an open file or diagonal, and consider the compensation self-evident.
But the value of an open line depends entirely on what your pieces can do with it.
If the line leads nowhere near the opponent's king, or if the opponent can close it or contest it quickly, the line is not compensation.
It is scenery. Genuine dynamic compensation requires 3 things to be true simultaneously. The opponent's king must lack a safe haven. The opponent's pieces must be unable to coordinate in time to defend. And the opponent's extra material must be unable to enter the game before your activity converts. When all 3 conditions hold, the compensation is real. When any one of them is missing, you need to look harder before committing. Which brings us to the most important practical discipline in this chapter: conversion. Dynamic compensation does not manage itself. It expires. That means before you play the sacrifice, you need to name the specific target you are converting toward. Not a general sense that your pieces will be active and something good will happen. A concrete target. A mating net. A forced material recovery. A transition into a winning endgame where the structural balance favors you. Without a named target, the sacrifice is speculative regardless of how energetic your pieces look. Piece activity is not a plan. It is a resource. The plan is what you do with it. One useful way to frame this is to think in terms of an activity horizon, the practical window of moves within which your compensation must produce a concrete result before the opponent stabilizes. The horizon is not a fixed number and depends on the position, but it is always finite, and in most middle game positions it is shorter than players expect. The practical test is to ask what happens if the opponent simply makes their best defensive move at every turn without blundering. Does your activity still convert under that condition? If the answer depends on the opponent making an inaccuracy, the compensation is not objectively sufficient. It may be practical compensation, in the sense that the position is difficult to defend, and errors are likely. But that is a different claim than saying the sacrifice is sound, and it is worth being clear about the distinction before you commit. A related failure mode is sacrificing for a single check or a short-lived threat with no follow-up. The pieces look active for one or two moves, the opponent defends, and the activity disappears. Nothing was converted, and the material shortfall persists. This is one of the more common errors in how intermediate players handle dynamic compensation, and it tends to stem from not naming a conversion target in advance. The habit to build is this: before the piece moves, you should be able to finish the sentence, "I am sacrificing this piece in order to," with something specific. A mating net on a particular set of squares. A forced win of a different piece. A pawn promotion that becomes unstoppable. If you cannot finish that sentence concretely, the sacrifice is not ready to be played. Visually impressive piece activity is not self-evidently sufficient. A position where your pieces are beautifully coordinated and aimed at the opponent's king can still be objectively losing if there is no concrete way to break through before the opponent consolidates. Beauty of coordination is not a substitute for a concrete outcome. Dynamic compensation is real, and it can absolutely justify a material sacrifice. But it requires a clear understanding of its transient nature and a precise plan for conversion. As you continue to explore exchange sacrifices, remember that the clock starts the moment the piece is given up. Chapter 8: Pawn Sacrifices for Structural Advantage and Long-Term Pressure. When a pawn sacrifice produces immediate piece activity, or opens a line toward the enemy king, you have something visible to point to. The board looks different right away. There is a concrete reason to feel confident. The category of sacrifice covered here does not work that way. The pawn goes, the position stays quiet, and the compensation is entirely structural. No immediate threat is generated. No clock starts ticking on a forced sequence. What you get instead is a lasting improvement to the pawn formation, and that improvement does the work slowly, over many moves, in ways that are easy to underestimate if you are not looking for them. The structural pawn sacrifice exchanges one pawn for a specific formation gain. That gain might be a pawn majority on one flank, a backward pawn forced onto the opponent, a semi-open file where your rook can apply continuous pressure, or the removal of a pawn that was defending a key square. None of them produce an immediate threat. All of them create pressure that accumulates as the game continues. The most common mistake players make after this kind of sacrifice is reading the quiet position as a sign that something went wrong. The thinking goes, if the sacrifice was sound, the board should look dangerous. If it looks calm, the pawn must have been lost for nothing. That reasoning is backwards. A structural sacrifice is supposed to produce a calm position. The compensation lives in the formation, not in the energy of the pieces. Doubled enemy pawns are real. A backward pawn on a half-open file is real. A pawn majority that will eventually create a passed pawn is real. None of these announce themselves loudly. They simply sit there and constrain what the opponent can do, move after move, for the rest of the game. Structure tends to outlast tactics. A weakness in the pawn formation does not disappear when the position simplifies, and it often becomes more significant as pieces come off the board. So the first mental adjustment this kind of sacrifice demands is learning to trust a quiet board. The absence of visible threats is not evidence of insufficient compensation. It is the normal appearance of a structurally superior position. Once that adjustment is made, the next question is more precise. What specific weakness has the sacrifice created, and is that weakness actually exploitable? This is the test of whether the sacrifice was sound in the first place, and it needs to be answered before the pawn is given up, not after. The three most commonly targeted weaknesses in structural pawn sacrifices are a backward pawn on a semi-open file, a weak color complex caused by pawn removal, and an isolated pawn that requires passive defense. Each of these is a genuine long-term liability when it meets certain conditions. The key word is conditions, because a nominal weakness and a real weakness are not the same thing. A backward pawn becomes a serious liability when two conditions hold simultaneously. It must sit on a semi-open file, so your rooks can press it directly, and its advanced square must be controlled firmly enough that the pawn cannot escape forward. If either of those conditions is missing, the backward pawn is uncomfortable, but not decisive. The opponent can either advance it safely or keep it on a closed file where your rooks cannot reach it. A weakness that can be repaired or hidden does not justify a pawn investment. A weak color complex works similarly. When a pawn is removed from the board, the squares it was defending become permanently accessible. If your pieces, particularly your minor pieces, can occupy multiple squares on that color, and the opponent has no effective way to contest them, the color complex becomes a genuine advantage. The test is whether your pieces actually dominate those squares in the specific position, not whether they theoretically could in some other arrangement. An isolated pawn is a target because it must be defended by pieces rather than by other pawns. That ties the opponent's pieces to a passive defensive role. But an isolated pawn only stays weak if the opponent cannot simplify the position by trading pieces and reaching an endgame where the pawn can be supported by the king or advanced safely. If the opponent has a clear path to that kind of simplification, the isolation is temporary. The practical pre-sacrifice requirement is to name the specific weakness before committing. Not a general sense that the opponent's structure will be worse, but a precise identification of which pawn or which set of squares will be permanently compromised, and why the opponent cannot repair it. A weakness the opponent can cover with simple piece regrouping is not compensation. A weakness that requires the opponent to permanently dedicate pieces to its defense, or that cannot be repaired by any available pawn lever, is the real thing. This naming process also reveals a common error, sacrificing to create a weakness that looks significant but can be neutralized by a single exchange of minor pieces. If the opponent can trade off the piece you are planning to use to pressure the weakness may survive on the board, while your ability to exploit it disappears. The weakness and the ability to attack it are both required. Neither alone is sufficient. Assuming the sacrifice was sound and the weakness is real and fixed, the work is not finished.
A structural advantage does not convert itself.
The position requires an active and ongoing plan, and that plan has a consistent shape across most structural sacrifices. The plan starts with piece placement.
The squares and files that the pawn structure now favors need to be occupied by the right pieces.
Rooks belong on the semi-open file created by the sacrifice, ideally doubled, pressing against the base of the opponent's pawn structure. Bishops should be pointed at fixed pawn weaknesses along open diagonals. Knights should be centralized or placed on advanced squares where they can repeatedly attack the weak pawn or the squares around the color complex. The pawn structure has created these opportunities, but they do not use themselves. The second element of the plan is managing exchanges. This is where many players lose a structural advantage they legitimately earned. The opponent's primary defensive resource against structural pressure is piece exchanges.
Trading off the pieces that are generating pressure on the weakness relieves the tension without repairing the formation. If the opponent can swap your most active minor piece, the one sitting on the outpost or controlling the weak color, the pressure drops significantly even though the pawn weakness technically remains. You need to remain alert to this throughout the game and generally decline exchanges that remove your most effective attacking pieces, unless the resulting endgame is clearly winning on its own terms. Maintaining at least one pair of rooks is usually important when the semi-open file is central to the compensation.
Exchanging both pairs of rooks can leave the backward pawn or isolated pawn technically weak but practically untouchable. The file pressure is what makes the weakness hurt. Without it, the opponent can consolidate around the weak pawn and hold. The third element is patience with the pace of conversion.
A structural sacrifice does not produce a decisive moment in the way a tactical combination does.
The position improves incrementally. Pressure builds. The opponent's pieces become more restricted.
At some point, the accumulated pressure forces a further concession, either another pawn weakness, a passive piece placement that allows a break, or a transition into an endgame where the structural advantage is decisive.
That transition point is the conversion, and it often comes quietly, without drama, as a natural consequence of the pressure that has been building for many moves. The structural sacrifice is considered successfully converted when the opponent's pieces are permanently tied to the defensive weaknesses with no meaningful counterplay, or when the position has simplified into an endgame where the formation advantage translates directly into winning chances. Getting there requires active management at every stage, placing pieces correctly, declining unfavorable exchanges, and continuing to increase pressure rather than assuming the position will manage itself. A position where the opponent must permanently dedicate resources to defending a weakness is a winning position, even when it looks quiet.
Chapter 9. Sacrifices in the Endgame and the Logic of Forced Simplification.
Endgame sacrifices operate under a stricter set of rules than anything that comes before them. That is not a vague claim. It follows directly from what the endgame actually is, a position where material has thinned, the buffer of extra pieces is gone, and every pawn, every king step, and every tempo carries weight that would be diluted in a fuller position. The tolerance for unresolved compensation that the middle game can sustain simply does not exist here.
In the middle game, a sacrifice can generate piece activity, open lines, and pressure that remains genuinely unresolved for many moves.
The opponent is often busy, the position is complex, and the compensation does not always need to be traceable to a single concrete outcome right away, because the density of the position can create practical difficulties that buy time. That buffer disappears in the endgame. When the board is simplified, the position becomes readable.
Defensive resources become clearer.
The opponent can calculate more accurately. And a sacrifice that produces only a more active arrangement of pieces, without a concrete mechanism behind it, will be refuted by accurate play. The distinction to internalize here is between a positional promise and a forced sequence.
A positional promise says something like, after this sacrifice, my pieces will be better placed, and I will have long-term pressure.
That reasoning is often sufficient in the middle game. In the endgame, it is not. A sound endgame sacrifice must lead to one of three things: a provably winning king position, an unstoppable passed pawn, or an inescapable Zugzwang.
If the sacrifice cannot be traced to one of those outcomes through concrete calculation, it is not yet justified, regardless of how active the resulting position looks.
A common error is treating an active king after a sacrifice as automatically sufficient compensation.
King activity is genuinely valuable in the endgame, in a way it is not in the middle game. But activity is not the same as a winning mechanism.
The king needs to be active in a direction that leads somewhere concrete, either to a decisive pawn race, a key square that forces promotion, or a configuration that puts the opponent in Zugzwang. The smaller the material count, the more precisely each element of compensation must be traced to an actual winning outcome. There is no complexity left to hide behind. One practical consequence of this is that amateur players frequently underestimate the defending side's resources in endgame positions.
In a simplified position, the defender can often find defensive checks, counter sacrifices, or drawing tricks that would be invisible in a denser middle game.
The most common of these are stalemate traps, where the defending side deliberately corners its own king to force a draw, and defensive checks that disrupt a king march.
These resources become available precisely because the position is simple enough for the defender to calculate them.
A sacrifice that looks winning on the surface can be refuted by a single defensive resource the attacker did not account for. This is why endgame sacrifice evaluation demands that you trace the sequence all the way to the end, not just to the point where your position looks good.
Promotion sacrifices are the clearest example of endgame sacrifice logic done right, because the arithmetic is verifiable.
The goal is unambiguous: get a pawn to the 8th rank.
The sacrifice is the means of removing whatever stands in the way.
What makes this category tractable is that you can calculate it to a conclusion. Either the pawn promotes, or it does not. The key concept here is the rule of the square. If the defending king stands outside the square formed by the pawn promotes before the king can catch it. The square is constructed by drawing a line from the pawn to the promotion square along the file, then extending a diagonal of equal length toward the side where the defending king stands.
The side length of that square equals the number of squares the pawn needs to reach the 8th rank, counting the promotion square, but not the pawn's current square.
This gives you a concrete geometric test.
Before sacrificing material to escort a pawn, you need to verify that the resulting position actually passes this test, or that the sacrifice creates a position where it will. The most common structural triggers for promotion sacrifices are deflection and clearance.
A deflection sacrifice pulls the defending king or a blockading piece away from the pawn's path. A clearance sacrifice removes a piece sitting on the promotion square or a critical square along the route. Both patterns appear frequently in positions involving outside passed pawns or connected passed pawns generated from a pawn majority.
The important distinction is between a pawn that is technically passed and one that is genuinely unstoppable.
A passed pawn with a defending king already inside the square, or with a piece capable of blockading the promotion square, is not yet unstoppable.
Many unsound promotion sacrifices fail precisely because the player treats these two things as equivalent.
The pawn is passed, so the sacrifice must work. But passed is a structural description. Unstoppable is a calculation result.
They are not the same. Standard defensive resources against a passed pawn include blockade on the promotion square, the back rank and third rank defensive techniques and rook endings, and stalemate tricks when the defending king is cornered. A particularly well-known drawing resource occurs in rook and pawn versus rook endings, with a rook pawn, meaning an A pawn or H pawn, where the defending king reaches the corner on the promotion square's file and cannot be dislodged.
The position is drawn either by stalemate if the attacking side promotes without giving check, or because the defending king cannot be forced from the corner without allowing the defending rook to give perpetual check. Knowing these resources matters, because any promotion sacrifice that does not account for them is not fully calculated. The test is simple. Can you trace the sequence from the sacrifice all the way to a forced promotion or a decisive material gain after queening? If you cannot, the sacrifice is not yet sound.
Zugzwang is the third category, and it requires a different kind of thinking entirely.
The definition is precise: a position where any legal move the opponent makes worsens their situation. The key word is any. If the opponent has even one neutral move, one move that does not meaningfully change the position, then it is not a true soccerve. It is an uncomfortable position, which is not the same thing. A sacrifice can be used to engineer Zugzwang deliberately, by removing the opponent's options. In a king and pawn ending, one side might sacrifice a pawn to reposition the king onto a Zugzwang-inducing square, transferring the obligation to move to the opponent in a configuration where every legal response loses. This appears extensively in endgame literature because, when correctly identified and calculated, it is among the more dependable winning techniques available in king and pawn endings. The sacrifice is not about gaining activity or opening lines. It is about removing options. Zugzwang is not exclusive to king and pawn endings, though those are the most common configurations. Piece endgames, including certain bishop and rook endings, also produce Zugzwang under the right material configurations. Opposite-colored bishop endings are a notable example, where the geometry of the position can leave one side with only losing moves available. The principle is the same regardless of the material. The sacrifice works by eliminating the opponent's flexibility, not by improving your own piece placement. The most common error in this category is failing to verify that the opponent has no waiting moves. A position where the opponent is uncomfortable, but can shuffle a piece back and forth without consequence, is not hukivang. The sacrifice to reach it is not sound. This verification requires tracing several moves ahead to confirm that after the sacrifice is played, every legal response genuinely worsens the opponent's position. Miscalculating the opposition, or missing a key square the opponent's king can reach, is enough to turn a winning sequence into a draw. What connects all three categories is the same underlying requirement. The sacrifice must be traceable to a concrete, calculable outcome. Not a better-looking position. Not more active pieces. A specific mechanism, a forced promotion, an inescapable Zugzwang, a provably winning king position that can be verified before the material leaves the board. The phase of the game determines which forms of compensation are valid. In the endgame, the vague positional promises that can sustain a sacrifice through the complexity of the middle game are no longer sufficient. The position is too clear, the resources too limited,
and the margin for error too small. Chapter 10: Defensive Sacrifices and the Logic of Giving Material to Survive.
Defensive sacrifices and the logic of giving material to survive. The defender faces a position that is objectively losing if material is held, and the question becomes whether releasing that material removes the condition that makes it losing.
The compensation the defender is looking for is not an attack or a structural edge.
It is survival or a draw. That is a legitimate, calculable outcome, and it deserves the same analytical rigor as any offensive combination. A defensive sacrifice is a voluntary release of material whose purpose is to eliminate the structural or tactical condition that makes the position losing.
The classification question is the same one established in the first chapter. Was there intent, and was there a mechanism behind the decision?
A defensive sacrifice passes that test when every material-preserving alternative has been evaluated and found worse. The error most intermediate players make here is treating any material loss under pressure as a failure. When the position is already under attack and something gets dropped, the instinct is to label it a mistake and move on. But the accurate question is whether releasing that material was actually the best move available.
Sometimes it is.
Sometimes the position is only drawable if a pawn is given to open an escape square for the king, or a piece is sacrificed to eliminate the last attacking pawn and reach a known drawn structure. Recognizing that possibility requires the same habit of candidate move thinking that applies to offensive play, except the candidate you are evaluating is a deliberate concession rather than an aggressive thrust. The calculation burden is also the same.
Verifying a defensive sacrifice means tracing all of the opponent's strongest responses, not just the intended drawing line.
The defender must confirm that no hidden winning resource exists for the opponent after the material is released.
In forcing positions, this can require searching several moves deep.
The goal is to reach a position that is either a known theoretical draw, a forced perpetual check, or a structure that cannot be broken. Until the calculation reaches one of those endpoints, the sacrifice is not confirmed as sound. It may only be delaying the loss, which is a different thing entirely.
One of the most concrete defensive mechanisms that a sacrifice can target is perpetual check.
The conditions required for a genuine perpetual check are specific, and meeting them is harder than the pattern suggests.
The checking piece must have a path that allows it to deliver checks on consecutive moves.
The opposing king must have no safe square to move to that breaks the repetition. And there must be no interposing piece that the opponent can place on the checking line without losing material they cannot afford to give up. All three conditions must hold simultaneously, and they must hold for every king move, not just the most obvious ones.
This is where a common error enters.
Many players assume that a perpetual check is available whenever the opponent's king looks slightly exposed. That assumption is wrong.
A king that is somewhat open is not the same as a king that is trapped in a forced repetition.
The checking piece needs a specific and repeating path, and the king needs to have no escape that breaks the sequence.
Verifying this requires checking every king move, including quiet retreats toward friendly pieces, which can sometimes create interposition possibilities that end the checks entirely.
The amateur error is calculating 2 or 3 consecutive checks, concluding the draw is available, and missing the single quiet move that escapes the sequence entirely. Genuine perpetual check is forced.
Temporary checking is not.
Many defensive sacrifices in the middle game are only correct because they lead to a forced perpetual. The sacrifice opens a line, removes a blocking piece, or draws the opposing king to a square where the checking sequence locks in.
The
The sacrifice itself is not the point. The perpetual it enables is the point. This means the calculation must not stop at the sacrifice. It must continue through the full checking sequence to confirm the repetition is unavoidable. A sacrifice that leads to 3 checks and then a king escape is not a defensive sacrifice. It is a blunder with extra steps. The third major defensive mechanism is the fortress. A fortress is a defensive structure in which the materially inferior side arranges pieces and pawns so that the stronger side cannot make progress, despite the extra material. The draw comes not from active counterplay, but from restricted mobility and fixed pawn geometry. The stronger side simply has no way to penetrate the position with correct play. The structural requirements for a genuine fortress are specific. The pawn chains must be fixed in a way that prevents the opposing king and pieces from reaching critical squares. The defending king must occupy a secure zone. It cannot be driven from by any available maneuver. The stronger side must have no pawn break that creates a new entry point, and no piece maneuver that infiltrates through an alternative route. These conditions need to be verified, not assumed. A position that looks like a fortress because it is difficult to crack in practice is not the same as a position that is theoretically drawn against optimal play. That distinction is the one that determines whether the defensive sacrifice was accurate or merely optimistic. Reaching a fortress sometimes requires sacrificing additional material to seal the position. A piece might need to be given up to eliminate the opponent's last active pawn, or a rook might be released to block a critical file and lock the pawn structure into place. The sacrifice is sound only when the resulting structure is verifiably unbreakable. Verifying this means checking every pawn break the stronger side can attempt, every king maneuver that might infiltrate through a side route, and every piece exchange that could reduce the defending pieces and leave the structure exposed. The stronger side's most reliable method of dismantling a fortress is creating a second weakness on the opposite wing, forcing the defensive structure to stretch beyond the zone it can hold. If that possibility exists, the fortress is not sound. A specific test worth applying is whether the defender can simply wait. A true fortress allows a waiting strategy. The defending side can shuffle pieces within the structure without being forced to move a critical pawn or abandon a key square. If the defender is eventually compelled to make a concession to avoid Zugzwang or a direct threat, the fortress was not as stable as it appeared. This is the same calculation discipline that applies to every other sacrifice type. The mechanism must be verifiable to a concrete endpoint, not just difficult to refute in practice. What ties all 3 of these mechanisms together is that the defender is doing exactly what the attacker does, just from the other side of the ledger. The attacker asks whether the compensation justifies the material cost. The defender asks whether the material cost removes the condition that makes the position losing. The attacker looks for a conversion target, while the defender looks for a drawing mechanism. The calculation requirements are identical. Trace every forcing reply, confirm the endpoint, and verify that the opponent has no resource that breaks the intended outcome. Offensive and defensive sacrifice logic are not separate skills. They are the same evaluative process applied to different goals. A player who can only think about material decisions in terms of what they gain has half a framework. The complete version includes the question the defender must ask: does holding this material make my position worse than giving it up? When the answer is yes, and the drawing mechanism is verified, releasing the material is not a concession. It is the most accurate move on the board. Chapter 11. Calculating sacrifice candidates and avoiding hallucination. Every sacrifice type covered so far has its own structural conditions,
its own compensation logic, its own failure modes.
But knowing what makes a sacrifice valid is a separate skill from actually calculating whether a specific sacrifice works in a specific position. The gap between those two things is where most errors happen. This chapter is about the calculation process itself, not the patterns it applies to.
The starting point is candidate move generation, and it has a specific problem when sacrifices are involved. When Alexander Kotov described the candidate move process in Think Like a Grandmaster, the core idea was straightforward. Before calculating any move, list all the moves worth examining.
Then take each one and calculate it fully before moving to the next. The discipline is in the separation. You generate the list first, and you evaluate afterward. It is worth noting that later analysts, including Jonathan Rowson and others, have pointed out that Kotov's model is an idealization. In practice, even strong players do not calculate each branch in strict isolation without revisiting earlier choices. But the underlying principle, that listing and evaluating should be treated as distinct steps, rather than collapsed into a single instinctive reaction, remains a useful framework for diagnosing where the process breaks down. In practice, most players do not generate a clean list. They generate a filtered one. The filtering happens automatically, before any calculation begins, and it is driven by instinct rather than logic. Moves that look safe or natural pass through. Moves that involve material loss often do not. A sacrifice gets rejected at the listing stage, before a single variation has been checked, simply because the material loss is visible and the compensation is not. This is the core problem. Sacrifices are systematically underrepresented in the average player's candidate list, not because they are rare or exotic, but because the instinct to avoid material loss acts as a filter before calculation even starts. The move never gets examined. It gets dismissed. The correction is procedural. When generating candidates, the conventional starting point is to scan for forcing moves, checks, captures, and direct threats. These get priority because the opponent's replies are constrained and the resulting lines are easier to trace. Sacrifices often qualify as forcing moves by this same standard. A sacrifice that delivers check, removes a key defender, or creates an immediate mating threat is forcing in exactly the sense that matters. It limits what the opponent can do next. The reason to include it in the candidate list is not optimism. It is that forcing moves are supposed to be on the list, and a sacrifice that genuinely constrains the opponent's options belongs there. The distinction worth holding on to is between a move that is forcing and a move that is merely aggressive. An aggressive move applies pressure, but leaves the opponent with multiple reasonable replies. A forcing move narrows those replies to a small, innumerable set. When a sacrifice is genuinely forcing, the opponent's responses are limited enough that the resulting lines can actually be calculated. When a sacrifice is speculative, the opponent has many ways to respond, and the outcome depends more on practical difficulty than on verified variations. Both can belong on the candidate list, but they require different handling once they are there. Once a sacrifice is on the list, the first question is not, what do I do next? It is, what does the opponent do next? This sounds obvious, but it is the step most commonly skipped. Players who calculate a sacrifice tend to calculate the line they want to see. The opponent plays the expected recapture. The attack develops cleanly. The king gets caught. That line may be accurate, but it is only one branch, and it is the cooperative branch, the one where the opponent helps. This is where hallucination enters the picture. Hallucination in calculation is the error of substituting a desired variation for a verified one. The player imagines the opponent playing a natural or obvious response, builds the rest of the line on top of that assumption, and reaches a conclusion that looks sound. The problem is that the assumed response was never checked. The opponent might have a better move, a quiet defensive resource, an interposition, a counter-sacrifice, a king walk to safety. If any of those exist, and the player has not looked for them, the entire line is built on a false foundation. Hallucination is especially common in sacrifice calculations, because the attacking idea is often visually compelling. The pattern looks familiar. The pieces line up. The king looks exposed. That visual pull creates confidence, and confidence reduces the impulse to check. The more convincing the sacrifice looks, the more tempting it is to trust the appearance, rather than verify the details. This is the same mechanism that makes pattern recognition dangerous when it fires on incomplete information. But here it shows up specifically inside the calculation tree, rather than at the moment of pattern recognition. What changes the outcome is a deliberate perspective shift. After calculating a line to what looks like a favorable conclusion, the player needs to switch sides and ask, from the opponent's position, what is the strongest available response at each critical branch point? This means looking for quiet defensive moves, which are easy to miss because they do not announce themselves. It means looking for counter-sacrifices that eliminate the attacker's key piece. It means checking whether the king has an escape route that the initial calculation assumed was closed. A useful habit is to run through the line a second time, with a single goal: find a refutation. If the line survives that search, the confidence in it is earned. If the search turns up a defense that works, the line needs to be revised or abandoned. The standard that matters here is not whether the sacrifice works against most responses. It is whether the sacrifice works against the best response. A line that beats 9 out of 10 defensive tries, but loses to the 10th, is not a sound sacrifice. The opponent only needs to find the one that works. There is a practical limit to how far this process can go, and knowing where that limit is matters as much as the process itself. Calculation has depth. At some point, the position after a sequence of moves becomes too complex to trace further with confidence. Piece locations become harder to hold in memory. Move order becomes uncertain. The cognitive load of tracking multiple branches simultaneously increases the chance of errors, including new hallucinations introduced by the effort of calculating too deeply. This is not a failure of discipline. It is a structural property of human calculation. The practical criterion for stopping is reaching a quiescent position, one where there are no immediate checks, captures, or direct threats remaining. At that point, the forcing complications have resolved, and the position can be evaluated rather than calculated. The question shifts from what happens next by force to which side is better and why. Pawn structure, piece activity, king safety, open files. These are accessible without tracing further lines. The important distinction is between stopping because the position is clear and stopping because further calculation has become intractable. If the sequence leads to a forced perpetual check, a clearly winning endgame structure, or a position where the material balance has stabilized and no immediate tactics remain, then stopping is appropriate, because the outcome is already determined. If the sequence leads to a complicated middle game position with many unresolved imbalances, stopping is still appropriate, but now positional judgment has to carry the weight that calculation cannot. The player needs to assess whether the resulting position is genuinely better, not just visually active. The error on one side is stopping too early, accepting a visually appealing position as winning without checking for the defensive resource that changes everything. The error on the other side is continuing to calculate past the point of resolution, tracing unlikely defensive tries far beyond practical relevance, and losing track of the simpler, clearer conclusion that was already available. Overcalculation rarely produces more accurate decisions. More often it produces fatigue, confusion, and a tendency to miss straightforward solutions while searching for complex ones. The practical boundary, then, is this: calculate until the forcing complications are exhausted. Search actively for the opponent's best defense at each critical branch, and when the position becomes quiescent or the outcome is accessible, switch to evaluation. The sacrifice is safe to commit to when the forced sequence can be verified to a concrete outcome. When the sequence leads somewhere accessible, but not fully calculable, the decision requires trusting the positional judgment built from everything established before this point. The calculation process can verify a sacrifice up to the point where forcing complications resolve. Beyond that point, the decision rests on positional judgment, and that judgment is only as reliable as the evaluative framework built across everything that came before it.